happened at home or in the preschool. And then other researchers came out and said, this isn't necessarily the best way to get the most valid information, but kids are somewhat aroused, they don't know what to make of dolls like this, and maybe there would be false positives related to these anatomically explicit dolls. So if you're interested in sort of the legal aspect of child psychology, there's a big literature on how you assess young kids for being possible victims of sexual abuse. What's the most devastating form of maltreatment of all? You wouldn't want to choose. This is a bad choice. But if you had to make a choice between physical abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect, meaning a family's not caring for the basic psychological and physical needs of a kid, neglect would, on average, have the most damaging long-term consequences. I'm not saying it's a good thing to be physically abused or sexually abused, but if you grow up in a home, often a home of utter poverty, chaos, substance abuse, too many kids, some of the kids in that home are not getting enough to eat, or the kids are being ignored systematically, and all the way to kids being locked in closets, long timeouts. I mean, you read some of the cases, years at a time, be an extreme form of neglect. The consequences are physical. These are kids who are malnourished, and you need a lot of protein in those first few years of life to help brain myelination. These are kids who grow poorly because they're not getting enough sustenance in them. These are kids who way too often end up in the mild to moderate range of intellectual disability. So the combination of lack of social contact and the lack of enough sustenance are leading to severe, in some cases, cognitive delays. What are the most common behavioral consequences? Well, if sort of the average with physical abuse is physical aggression, and sexual abuse internalizing symptoms. With neglect, you could get either social withdrawal, a very withdrawn kid, or a kid who's quite active, even looking hyperactive. There's a lot of variation here. There's no absolute one-on-one linkage between neglect and how the kid's behaviorally acting later on. So if neglect is, in many ways, the most devastating of all, why is there much more scientific study of physical abuse and sexual abuse? Some people in the profession call it, we neglect neglect. And part of the reason is neglect is the product, much more than on average, of poverty, families who don't have very good cognitive skills themselves, and it's sort of the forgotten stepchild, if you will, to use sort of a bad metaphor of the maltreatment area. Now let's take some really interesting, it's pretty horrifying, but interesting research. If you read up on this, or you saw 60 Minutes years ago when you were younger, back in Eastern Europe in the 70s and 80s, especially in Romania under the dictator Ceausescu, there was a policy where many kids, if a family was just poor, were put into orphanages. And the orphanages were these huge snake pit-like places where kids would be in cribs in a sterile room with sort of slatted bars over them and would be fed through the bars once or twice a day. Never lifted up, no human contact. So it was institutional neglect of a high order of magnitude. So Ceausescu was deposed and assassinated in 1989, and Westerners went in, and there's these institutions with thousands of these horribly neglected kids. Some of them were systematically adopted into Romanian homes or into other European homes. And of course, there was no random assignment as to who was put in these institutions. But some kids were just a year old. They'd only been in the institution 6 months. Some were 2 years old. They'd been in a year and a half. Some 3 years old. They'd been in 2.5. So the independent variable in the research that emerged was, is there from Psych 140, development psych, is there a critical period or a sensitive period? How long did you have to be neglected like this before there would be horrible consequences? And it turns out there was no cutoff point. There was no absolute critical period. It was a straight line. It was sort of a sloping line. The longer you'd been in such an institution, by age 6, by age 9, by age 12, the greater the chances were that you would have an intellectual disability, be mentally retarded. The greater the chances are that you would have a very interesting pattern of attachment. What's the most common behavioral manifestation of these kids? If they're not severely retarded and they're out in the community, they run up to strangers and indiscriminately hug them all the time. So it's kind of like no boundaries learned, and you could say, well, that's natural, but what does that make these kids susceptible to? Getting abused later, sexually especially. So what's the most common behavior shown by these kids adopted away from these institutions? Very severe inattention and a lot of hyperactivity. So if you've ever heard of something called what? Equifinality. We know that genes in many kids play a big role. Heritability to ADHD is high. But a very different pathway to inattention and overactivity is severe neglect in the first couple of years of life. It leads to what looks very similar, very severe inattention and very severe overactivity, but with one exception. The kids who've been neglected systematically, who show this inattention and overactivity, also tend to show this attachment pattern of indiscriminate friendliness, which most kids with ADHD who've not been neglected do not show. Make sense? Chuck Nelson, who was at Minnesota then, moved to Harvard, really great child psychologist, did an amazing study. It was published in the journal Science, the top journal in the whole field, a few years ago. He worked with the Romanian government, and there were still some of the institutions back there. And Romania didn't have, it's an economically deprived country, it's kind of moving up the economic ladder. He worked out the first experimental study. So some kids, and still in remaining orphanages, they weren't as bad as the orphanages from 20 years before. Some of these kids would do what? Would stay in an institution because there was not enough adoptive homes, and some, on a basis of a flip of a coin, would be adopted. So it's an experimental trial of how long this deprivation might go on. And as you might guess, I mean, you think, well, is this an unethical study? It was approved in the United States, it was approved in Romania because there weren't enough adoptive families to go around. And the kids who got adopted into homes and got more one-on-one family care ended up emotionally and cognitively a couple years later better than the kids who stayed on in the institutions. So it's a pretty interesting example of, can we ever really know what's a causal risk factor? Remember, back in the day, a few weeks ago in this course, we know a lot of risk factors, we know a lot of fixed and malleable ones, but a causal one you could only know if there was an experiment where you randomly assigned. And this is the one case in the neglect field where it does seem as though if you can get the kid into a loving home relatively early, there's a better chance of behavioral and cognitive and social adjustment. Here's a category we're not going to spend a lot of time on, but not because it's not important. What about emotional abuse? What about if you get called names by your parents or your older siblings? A lot. So you're not wailed upon physically, you're not violated sexually, you're not neglected, but there's a climate of verbal interchange that's abusive emotionally. Ridicule, humiliation, threats of harsh punishment. Now, I don't know if a wooden spoon would count, but there's, without the physical punishment, constant chronic threats of, you're going to get it if you don't. So as you might guess, this is the hardest one to define. because every parent's sarcastic sometimes. If you don't do your homework, you're going to be grounded for the next 2 years. Right, well, right. I mean, parents frustrated. They're never going to ground you for 2 years. That probably wouldn't qualify as emotional abuse. But where's the dividing point? Now, a subcategory here is, what if you're a young kid and you witness your mom and dad, or your dad and his partner, your mom and her partner, hitting each other? Witnessing of domestic violence. So it's not really physical abuse, because the kid's not getting hurt, but the kid's witnessing the parents verbally and physically harming each other. That's, in some definitions, a subcategory of emotional abuse. And these are kids, not surprisingly, with a lot of post-traumatic stress and externalizing acting out behaviors. So an important role in prevention is, even if a kid's not directly getting abused, can we prevent partner discord and partner violence, because that's a risk factor for kids' problems as well. We could get into, if we had much more time, kids at a very young age forced into prostitution. What about child labor? It wasn't until the 20th century that child labor laws were enforced in the United States. You can see the pictures in history books of 7-year-olds in coal mines working 40-hour weeks or longer. So it's been a pretty recent thing. It's only been the last 100 years or so that we've systematically taken out of operation other institutional ways of maltreating kids. Questions on any of this? This was a way too rapid tour of physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, and emotional abuse. Question here.
I wanted to go back to when you were talking about physical abuse, and I think that we should outlaw physical abuse, but then if that means that it's going to, parents are going to turn to emotional abuse, how do you decide that?
That's right. So we're going to outlaw physical abuse. So parents now, to get their kids in line, are going to have to scream louder and maybe humiliate the kid, find some way to get the kid to stop doing dangerous things. Probably not the outcome we'd expect. So I don't have a good answer to that question, and I think this is why policy is so hard. Should kids be beaten up? No. Is some physical abuse allowable? I think I'm on the side of, I don't think we can outlaw all forms of physical abuse, but it's a fine line, because once you say it's okay, and the parent says, well, I guess it's okay to hit my kid, then you're opening the door for those physical punishments to be delivered in accordance with the parent's anger and not systematically. But as you say, maybe that'll prevent emotional abuse on the other side. Hard to know. Who else? Yes? So mandated reporting goes to physical abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect, but not emotional abuse in most states, because it's so hard to define. Question here. That's right. That's right. So what do you do about subcultural differences? Or what about schools? Is it okay to use a yardstick? So my mom, Midwestern gal back in the day, she'll turn 89 later this spring. We'll go out for a family visit and birthday. When she was in 4th grade, did this ever get reported? No. She had a very strict teacher. And could you come up for a second for a little demonstration? Yeah, just real quick. So you have to see it. And so the teacher would go around, and if the students did not have a right answer, the teacher would take her finger and flip the bridge of their nose. Brings tears to your eyes if you do it hard. So, excuse me, you didn't answer that question. So do we outlaw that, or was that a good strict teacher back in the 1930s? These are the tough calls, because subculture, ethnicity, history, can we have one universal standard? Who else? Yes? If you're playing with your friends, okay, you go to the dunce chair, I mean the timeout chair, right? It's right. Many people, no, it wasn't, but many people would say a timeout if the parent does it non-abusively. The kid knows they're missing out on the privilege. It can be effective. It's much better than physical abuse. Probably it's embarrassing, but maybe that's why partly it's effective. And again, that's why emotional abuse is so hard to define. Absolutely. So how much physical abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect is there? It depends on whom you ask and how. So official reports, I mean, now we've got mandated laws, but official reports probably capture 10% of it. There's much more that happens than comes into the attention of the Child Protective Services. Reported is about 1% of kids. If you believe Diana Russell, who's a professor at Mills, who's been doing this for 30-some years, who does random phone dialing of interviews with women, 30% of women in the Bay Area back in the 80s and 90s reported being sexually abused at some point in their lives. So the difference between 1% and 30% is a big difference. Depends on whether it's confidential, and again, official reports are going to underestimate. On average, males are more likely to perpetrate sexual abuse. Mothers, because it's so many single moms, are more likely to be brought in on neglect charges, which sort of makes sense. Girls are more likely than boys to be victims of sexual abuse, but boys certainly can be too. If a kid has an intellectual disability, quote, mentally retarded in the old lingo, or has physical disabilities, that ups the risk of that kid being abused by a factor of at least 3. So kids who are vulnerable, who can't fight back or can't use their words, are more likely to be victims. Is maltreatment linked to poverty? Yes, especially neglect, but maltreatment of kids is an equal opportunity risk factor. So very quickly, and then we'll pick this up at the beginning of next time, disorganized attachment. If a kid is really abused in the first year of life, that kid is likely to have this D category where they freeze in front of the caregiver at the reunion. And that's predictive of later externalizing behavior. Emotion dysregulation. Post-traumatic stress disorder is one of the questions raised a few minutes ago. At a very basic level, kids who've been physically abused have trouble telling the difference between the negative emotions of anger versus fear. And their brains light up differently in the brain scanner when they're doing those emotion recognition tasks. It may be that severe early maltreatment changes your wiring in your brain, makes it hard for you to recognize emotions. So more on neural development, physical traumas we talked about might really give you a head injury. But what about the stress of waiting for the punishment or waiting to be sexually abused? Stress has hormonal and neurotransmitter consequences, so there can be physical consequences even if your head isn't barged up against the wall. Internalization. Many kids who've been abused, maltreated, feel that somehow they're to blame. And being betrayed and feeling powerless is part of the dynamic. So we'll pick up a little bit of this next time, go into internalizing. Shake will have his sections midterms out back, right? So head out the back door, so we'll let the next class in. See you next time.